All right. Just 1 second. That's better. I got an email from one of the students in the class who asked in particular for a request to do a class on lifting the divine sparks, the concept of rectification, turning darkness into light, and as far as both tzadik and benoni are concerned. So I want to address at least a little bit of that tonight, if not in full, because to address it in full is going to be quite a challenge, since it will require a large number of classes to really deal with it fully. But in any event, to some extent, we will deal with it now. I'm going to be reading and translating from a work called Darash Tov, which is one of the collections of sayings and teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Baal Shem Tov himself wrote very little. Most of what he said that we have today was recorded by his students, and some of it by his son, whose name is Tzvi, but most of it was by his students. In any event, the subject here is the concept of Tikkun. He said a number of different things about Tikkun, but I found this particular one very interesting and very, very illustrative of Drash Tov is the name of the book. Drash Tov, D-R-A-S-H, Drash Tov, or in Hebrew, Dalad Resh Shin, and the word Tov, Tetvav Bet. Okay, so what does the Baal Shem Tov have to say? He says as follows, that the Creator, the blessed Creator, I don't think there's any much use me reading the Hebrew first, but if anyone wants me to read the Hebrew first, I will. If just type into the chat box if you want me to read the Hebrew. Otherwise, I'll just translate it straight. Anyone? Yes. Okay. All right. Fine. So he says like this: Haboire Yidbarach, the Creator, the blessed Creator, Mar'eh, he shows L'kol echad, to each person, Tikkun nafsho, the Tikkun that his soul needs. Now, let me just take a step back for a minute and explain that every soul came into the world because it needs a Tikkun. There's no soul here living in this world today that does not come for a Tikkun. There are some souls that come only to metaken other souls, to rectify other souls. But the main point of a soul coming into this world is for its own Tikkun. There are some that say that the Arizal came into this world. Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the famous Kabbalist who lived in Tzfat, Safed, in Israel in the 1500s, some say that his soul came down not for its own tikkun, but for the purpose of to metaken other souls, to rectify many, many, many other souls. And in fact, he passed away at a very young age. He was only 39 when he passed away, and he accomplished a tremendous amount in his 39 years, to the extent that he was known far and wide. But in any event, if a person is living in the world, generally 99.99% probably he's here because he needs a tikkun. Rabbi Vital was his student, that's right, yeah. So a person comes into this world because they need a tikkun. His soul needs a tikkun of some sort or another. So he said that the Creator shows everybody the tikkun that their soul needs. Ukeshorei is a ish magusham, when you see a coarse person, when he says a person who's magusham might be translated as someone very into this world, very much into the delights of this world. Magusham, very coarse, and when we mean coarse, when we say coarse, we don't mean coarse necessarily in language, but his consciousness is fixated on physicality. He's a very materialistic kind of a person. And materialistic doesn't necessarily mean only money wise, but his body is much more importance to him than his soul in general. So when you see kasheroeh, when a person sees eze ish magusham, someone who is very coarse, a coarse person, makashroi baruchaniyut, he attempts to attach him to a spiritual root. Kedai la'alot nefesh hamagusham, in order to elevate, to raise up that coarse soul. Tikkun then to someone not familiar with the vocabulary, someone who contributes to the enlightenment of all. No, not necessarily. A tikkun means a rectification. Our souls come down to this world in one sense or another, lacking somewhat. Now, the purpose that the soul comes down to the world lacking something is that throughout their lifetimes, they're given the opportunity to rectify that blemish or that thing that they lack. Why is it done that way? Because the Zohar explains, because Nahama de Kisufa, which means the bread of shame, which translates as free, a free stipend. A free stipend is not going to do you any good. You become a spoiled brat that way. If everything is given to you for free, you become like a spoiled brat. Witness the royal couple who have been in the news recently. I don't usually get into this kind of stuff, but that's a perfect example of people who are spoiled brats because they got everything they need. On the other hand, I actually just heard an interview with Colonel Alan West, who is a very distinguished. He was a very distinguished military man and a very distinguished politician. It happens to be a very refined and very intelligent politician, a very intelligent person in general. And he was talking to someone about the situation in the black community, which he's part of. He happens to be a black person. The situation in the black community is that a very high percentage of out of wedlock births happen. It's like, it's like 74, 76% of African American families are today in America, their children are born out of wedlock. In other words, single mother family. And he explained why. He said because in the 60s, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the president at that time, made the decision, of course, with the government behind him, that single mothers should be supported. They should be supported by the government. At that time, there was only something like 24% of black families had children out of wedlock. But as soon as the government removed the need for a two-parent family by the government becoming, so to speak, the absentee father, that's when things started to mushroom. In other words, that's when these families of this is what Alan West said. Whether it's true, whether it's not true, I'm not getting involved in the politics of it, but I want to bring out the point that he made. The point was that when you give people something for nothing, they don't work for it. They don't work for it anymore. They don't feel any value in doing the work. Now, was not true in his case. He worked himself up. He lived in the slums in whatever city he was in, and he worked himself up to be a very distinguished intellectual and a very accomplished military man. The point is that the Zohar says when you give Nahama de Kisufa, you give the bread of shame, the free bread to people, they stop working. They regard it as a right, as as something which is the word in the expression in Hebrew magiali. It belongs to me. I deserve it. You didn't do anything to deserve it, and therefore, and we're talking about spiritual levels over here. Therefore, A person is expected to work on his own soul in order to bring it to its fullness, in order to bring out the inner dimensions of the soul to the fullest extent possible. In other words, to bring out the light from within and make it shine to the fullest extent possible. Without doing any work, it's never going to happen. You can't really expect somebody else to do the work for you. That's the point. That's the main point over here. So, what we said was, that what the Baal Shem Tov said was that everyone is shown the tikkun of his soul, what his soul needs to accomplish in order to effect its rectification, to bring out its fullness and to fully express its inner light. So, therefore, when you see a person who's very magusham, very coarse and crass, and you attach him to spirituality in order to lift him up and raise him up from this level of a very crass, a very coarse, a very materialistic soul. And then then it can happen when he makes the effort to attach himself to a tzadik, to a holy person, and that person can help him to do whatever is necessary in order to um, raise that soul up to um, to a high level. Yes, yeah, that is true. It's not only in black communities. That's just the example that he was giving because he was talking to people about the black community. It's true in white communities as well. Yes, it's true in poor white communities as well. Absolutely, that caused a rash of you know fatherless families, unfortunately. Um, yeah, let's not get into the politics of it. I really don't. I don't want to get into the politics. It was just an illustration of a point. That's all. I'm not trying to put anyone down, and I'm not trying to point any fingers to anybody. I'm just saying that when someone is giving bread for nothing, so to speak, that is a recipe for disaster. In fact, let me just expand this idea. We haven't nearly finished yet, by the way, but just let me just expand this idea. We see that the Israelites, from the moment they came out of Egypt, they started complaining. Yeah, there's no water, there's no food, there's no this, there's no that, we need this, we need that, and so on and so forth. What was their rectification? How did that mindset get changed? And the answer is that God told them to build a tabernacle, and everyone had to contribute. Doesn't matter what you contributed. Some contributed gold, some silver, some wool, some other kinds of metals, some wood. Those who didn't have any possessions contributed of their time, of their efforts, of their skills, of their intelligence, whatever it is, in order to be able to build a tabernacle. So, in other words, in order to be able to rise beyond yourself, you have to contribute. That's the that was there. You have to contribute of yourself in order to rise beyond yourself. Otherwise, you're just going to stay as a the way the Zohar puts it is you have these what's called klipa. Klipa means the outer shell. In other words, not the inner core of something, but the outer shell, and the outer shell that has become tainted spiritually. So the outer shell that has become tainted spiritually just says have means give me, right? Give me. That's the gimme attitude is not going to get anyone anywhere. You have to give in order to get, and you have to give willingly, without the expectation of getting any reward. To give without the expectation of reward is the highest form of giving, and then if a person is worthy of it, the reward will come. In any event, so let's say that a person who's very coarse and very crass and very low on the totem pole, so to speak, of spiritual development, how can he elevate himself? By attaching himself to a tzaddik, by attaching himself to a holy person. Okay? Now, the Baal Shem Tov now goes on to explain how the tzaddik does certain rectifications for the person. Now, you may think that this contradicts what I just said, that you have to do what you can for yourself. It's just that the tzaddik makes things easier, and certain rectifications which you would not, which you possibly a person would not be able to do in this life, certain tikkunim he would not be able to achieve in this life. He would have to come again into Gilgul, reincarnation. We have to be reincarnated again in order to rectify it in another lifetime. So those kinds of things the tzaddik can rectify for such a person. He can smooth the way, in other words. That's basically the idea. But the Baal Shem Tov explains a little bit more. There are two types of rectification. He says like this. Echad, one of them is Misha Asa Aveira, a person who transgressed one of the commandments of the Torah, Upagam benafsho, and he caused a blemish in his soul, in the upper reaches of the soul, Ba'olamot Elyonim, in higher levels of the soul. The soul is not just one level, not one level of consciousness. There are 5 levels. We've discussed this before, but for those of you who aren't familiar, there are 5 levels of the soul, 5 levels of consciousness. The lowest level of consciousness, physical consciousness, is called nefesh, and that belongs, so to speak, in this physical world. It's the consciousness of the physical world. Then there is the level of consciousness, the level of soul, which is called ruach, which corresponds to a higher level world. A world is, in Kabbalah, the concept of world, olam, means a concealment of the divine light. All worlds conceal the divine light to some extent, some much more so. The lowest of worlds, which is our physical world, is the lowest aspect of the world of Asiya, conceals the light to the greatest extent. Then the world of Yetzirah, which is the next world up, conceals it less. Then the world of Bria even less. In the world of Atzilut, godliness is revealed. And the world of Adam Kadmon, which is the highest possible level, that is where godliness is revealed in its infinite expanse. Okay, so the lowest level of soul corresponds to the world of Asiya, to this lowest world. The next level of soul is called Ruach, and that corresponds to the world of Yetzirah. And then there is Neshama, corresponds to the world of Bria, and Chaya to the world of Atzilut, and finally Yechida corresponds to the level of Adam Kadmon, the world of Ak, or Adam Kadmon. Okay, so what he says is, someone who has caused a blemish in one of the levels of his soul, the higher levels of his soul. Obviously, he caused a blemish in the level of his soul in this world because that's where he's living now. He wouldn't be here if not for the fact that there's a blemish that he has to fix. So that's obvious, but there's also blemishes in the higher worlds. Lazeh, for this, tzarich hatzadik letaken nafshoy lesaken hapagam. You need a tzaddik to fix that up because you can't really do it yourself. Why? Because you don't know about it. You don't know how to access those high levels of soul. The proof of the fact that you don't know how to access is that we're talking about a person who's coarse and crass and materialistic. Had he not been so coarse and crass materialistic, he would have known how to rectify himself possibly. But in order to rectify higher levels of the soul, that where there is a pagam, where there is some kind of blemish, he needs to the tzaddik comes to help him. Are there souls among us from Adam Kadmon or Atzilut? Yes, there are. Certainly, I would say that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was certainly a soul of Atzilut, and maybe even higher than that. But in each of us, we have that potential. In other words, all of us have a Yechidah Benefesh, and that Yechidah Benefesh corresponds to Adam Kadmon. So there are tzaddikim, there are great tzaddikim. There were not only the Lubavitcher Rebbe, there was the Rav Kaduri, and in previous generations, the Rashash, there was the Arizal, there was the Baal Shem Tov. In every generation, there are souls of the loftiest levels, corresponding to the world of Atzilut, or even higher than that. Okay, so let's continue. So he needs a tzaddik letaken nafsho letaken pagam, to rectify his soul and to rectify the blemish that was done to the higher levels of soul. Now, when we say the higher levels of soul, the truth is that the level of Chaya and Yechida cannot be damaged. Maybe the level of Chaya can be damaged only in the sense that it doesn't illuminate fully, but the level of Yechida can never actually be damaged by the things that a person does down here in this world. Only the three lower levels of the soul, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, are actually blemished by what you would call sin, transgression of the commandments. Okay, let's continue. וזה נקרא שלמות שמשלים הפגם. This is called wholeness. That's the perfection that a person can achieve is when the pagam, the blemish, is rectified, the blemish is removed. Now, if someone will just remind me, to talk about what's called ibur, just write it down, and someone remind me later. I'll talk about ibur. Ibur is a way that the soul can get higher than itself, right? Higher than its own root. We'll discuss that shortly. Is there a tzaddik today? Yes, there are tzaddikim. Yes, definitely. Don't tell me now. Tell me soon. Okay, let's continue. So, what does the tzaddik do? He says like this, shlemut, and this is the completion, this is the perfection of his soul. V'yeshuhu magusham, so that's one type of person. V'yeshuhu magusham machmat katnut haseichel. Other people are on a lower level because of mental immaturity, not because of they're into the delights of this world and that makes them coarse and lowly, but because they have a small-minded view of things. They look at things from the point of view of a very narrow point of view. Usually a narrow point of view which involves their own ego or their own, let's call it their own feelings, how they feel about things. The truth is that most people don't really care about your feelings. That's just that's just the way it is. Be aware. Most people do not really care. There are people who are very caring people who do care about other people's feelings, but if a person is always claiming that they're insulted or that they're soon people stop caring because there's nothing that you can do anymore to satisfy such a person. It just goes on and on and on forever. All right, let's continue. One has to be are they younger souls? The second category are the younger souls, narrow-minded. They not necessarily. They may be, but not necessarily. Oh, let's just see what he says with as far as those are concerned. Anyway, okay. So he says, yeah. So again, there are those people who are on a low level because of their katnut, because of their intellectual immaturity. Lazeh, and for this, tzarich la'alot nafsho. The person, the tzaddik, needs to raise up that person's soul, or the person needs to raise up his own soul, migashmiyut laruchaniyut, from physicality, from a focus on the physical world, usually a focus on his own narrow interests, or his own narrow emotional reactions to things, and focus on a broader spectrum of things outside of himself. Not focus on himself, inwards on himself, but outwards on higher spiritual realms, higher spiritual levels. And then that's called aliyat ha'olamot, the raising up of the world. In other words, the elevation of the worlds to a higher place. And that can be done simply as a mind thing, right? It doesn't need a tikkun in the same way that someone who's involved in the physical, has become very physically coarse, needs a tikkun. It's a different kind of tikkun. It's a tikkun which a person can get by deep thinking and meditation. Okay. Correspondingly, there are also two kinds of tzaddikim. We just said that there are two kinds of lowliness. One which comes from too much of a focus on the physical and material things. The other comes from too much of a focus. And I say too much. One has to focus somewhat on material things. It's important to be aware that you're living in the world and you have to live in the world in the proper way. But too much of a focus on that causes a person to become spiritually coarse and physically coarse, and that can be best rectified by the tzaddik. The second, the second way, the second type of lowliness is mental um, small-mindedness, mental immaturity, an immature attitude, which usually means focusing on oneself, on one's own ego, rather than nullifying one's own ego to a greater cause and to greater meaning and to greater understanding, etc., etc. Okay. Yesh minei tzadikim. There are two kinds of tzadikim. Yesh yachid yichudim v'tzirufim. There is a tzaddik who does what's meyachid yichudim. He unifies unifications. I know it's a repetition of but that's just how Hebrew works. In other words, he does what's called unifications in Kabbalistic terminology. Unifications means that he brings together apparently disparate things, and he makes out of these disparate things a composite whole. Right? In other words, let's put it in the terminology that Kabbalah usually uses. If you take four random letters and you put them together, it can even be two letters. It doesn't have to be four letters. I'm just using four as an example. The Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, one of the earliest Kabbalistic works that we have today, which was written, apparently was transmitted by Abraham to his descendants. It was only written down much, much later, but it was transmitted orally as an oral teaching, as a mystical teaching through the generation from the time of Abraham. Now, the Sefer Yetzirah says that since letters are the building blocks of creation, we've discussed this before a number of times, since letters are the building blocks of creation, when you take letters, because letters are the building blocks of consciousness, right? Consciousness is something that you can express, in which you can express certain ideas and certain feelings and certain awarenesses and so on and so forth, but it's usually expressed either in a verbal language or in an inner language, the language of the mind. But that's what consciousness is. A higher level of consciousness is what's expressed in the letters of the mind, so to speak. Now, this is not necessarily letters, although the Hebrew letters are representative of this. But when a person is doing a yichud, in other words, a unification that he just mentioned, it's as if you're taking four letters or even two letters, the Sefer Yetzirah says, and you're making them into a meaningful combination. For example, if you take the two letters, let me just share a screen over here, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so you have two letters, an aleph, let's say, and a bet, the first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet, right? So these first two letters of the Hebrew alphabet, if you combine them on their own, they don't mean anything. An aleph on its own, the letter has a meaning, but it doesn't give you a concept, right? And the letter bet has a meaning, and it also doesn't give you a concept. For example, the first letter of the Torah is actually a bet. First letter, Bereshit, of the word Bereshit. Bereshit bara Elokim. This is written the way it's written in script, and this is the way it's written in script, and this is the way it's written in the Torah as a bet, sort of like that, right? The letter bet. So the letter bet is the same as the word bayit. Bayit means a house, a home, right? But it also means inside. So the first consciousness, that the first letter of consciousness that's found in the Torah is the ability to distinguish between inside and outside. That's what a bet is. A bet is the by it what's inward, what's inside, and everything else is outside. So that distinction, that's the first distinction that needs to be made. In any event, the Sefer Yetzirah goes on to say that you can build a house with one stone, right? Each letter is like a stone which you build with. So you need two letters to build a house, right? Minimum of two letters. So aleph bet together makes the word av, which means a father, right? Alternatively, if you switch around the order, if you switch around as bet aleph, it means ba, to come, right? To come to a certain lavo, to come to a place, right? Hine hu ba, here he is coming, and so on. Okay, so these letters together are sort of building blocks. Now, when a tzaddik does yichudim, what he does is um, essentially what he does is he reads the letters that are um, emanated by your presence. I don't know if emanated is the right word, but that are yeah, let's use the word emanated, even though the word emanated is used for other things usually, but never mind. So the letters that are emanated by you, by your presence, by your existence. In other words, there's a sort of um, spiritual chain of letters, an algorithm, let's call it, a spiritual algorithm, permutation, yeah, good. A spiritual permutation that is who you are. That's what brings you into being. That's you. That permutation, the tzaddik is able to read and he's able to change. He's able to change it in such a way that's beneficial to you. He won't change it to be beneficial to him. Then he's not called a tzaddik, a righteous, a holy person. He's called a rasha, a wicked person, an evil person. Right? So a tzaddik will only do something that's a benefit to another person. Um, in fact, the whole word tzaddik comes from the word tzedek, which means righteousness or justness, right? The paths of the just, the righteous. In any event, that's what a tzaddik does. He is miyached yuchudim. He combines the letters that you produce, the algorithm that he can see in you, with other components in order to produce a positive blend, a positive algorithm, a positive permutation. Now, that might mean that he has to take the negative permutation and turn it around. Right? Now, a tzaddik can do this, and sometimes he can do it simply with a glance. Just at a glance. Just glance at a person, it's enough. This is what the Baal Shem Tov goes on to say. So again, there's two types of tzaddikim. Yesh miyached yichudim v'tzirufim. There's one type of person that he does unifications and permutations, and he's got that down pat, and then he can use them just very effortlessly. That person can rectify with just looking at whoever it is that he's attempting to rectify. Just looks at him, and that's sufficient. There are those who say that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, that's one of the reasons that he had dollars on Sunday. People would come past and then would get $1 from him. And they were often, I mean, I went past him a number of times, and I was also in his sitting in his synagogue, when he gave what's called a Farbrengen many times. But in any event, they say that people would, when the people standing in line, just in that very brief second when he looked at you, and he gave you that $1, and of course it was all free, you didn't have to pay for the experience or whatever. You walked by. He was doing his tikkun at that particular time, and there are actually several cases of people that I know who were either suffering from some illness or having some kind of difficulty in their lives, who that was a transformative moment, transformed them from what they were into something else completely. But that's what a tzaddik can do simply by looking at a person, not just looking at them, but looking into them, seeing their permutation and manipulating. Manipulating is not the right word, but changing that permutation into a positive permutation rather than the negative permutation that it may be at this point in time. Let me give you an example, right? An example would be, let me just clear the drawings. um, there's there's a story about the story in the book of Ruth where it talks about Naomi that she was marat nefesh. The word marat is from the word mar, or in the female form and the feminine form mara, right? Mara. Mara means bitter. She was in a state of bitterness. She would say she'd lost her husband passed away, and then her two sons both passed away, and she's left with her two daughters-in-law, right? Both of whom weren't Jewish. Ruth then converted, but the other one did not. But anyway, she was Mara. She was in a state of bitterness. And they went to, she went to Elkanah, who was a cousin, and he, in fact, married Ruth eventually. Let's not go through the whole story, but one of the things that it's explained is that the word Mara, if you reorganize, you rearrange the letters, it spells Haram. Now, Haram in Hebrew means the elevated one. So from Mara can become Haram, right? Haram, the person who is elevated and elevated to a very high level. The high level is called Ramah, still the same letters, right? And that can be done Maher, right? Same letters again, just the same letter. I'm showing you the different permutations. Maher means speedily. So for someone who is very bitter, can be changed into someone who regards themselves as lofty, as elevated. They see the loftiness of their own soul, the loftiness of their own potential. That lifts them up to a height, and that can be done very, very speedily. All the same letters, right? Okay, good. We will continue. Okay, so that's what the Baal Shem Tov said can be done simply with the histaklut, with the looking, the tzaddik looks at the person and can do the rectification. But if the person is stubborn, and he does not allow himself to be rectified, the Baal Shem Tov would, or the tzaddik would remove that spark from him completely. Oh, so I missed out a few lines. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. So what would he do? We just explained that by looking at him, he would be able to rectify him. And how would that be manifested? V'tekev mevi bo hirur tshuva. It would come into the person, the feeling, the idea, the thought would suddenly arise in the person's mind. I have to improve myself. I have to change my way of doing things. I have to do things in the proper way. I cannot carry on in this kind of way anymore. That's called tshuva, the idea of returning to a higher state of being. So what the tzaddik would do was he would do the rectification, which would cause the person to want to do tshuva. As I said in the beginning, it's not only the tzaddik can help, but he engenders in the person this feeling, I've got to change myself. And he has to then do the work of changing himself. The tzaddik's not going to be able to do that for him. He has to do it for himself. He, obviously, meaning he or she. Right? And now we continue. As we heard from the Baal Shem Tov himself, that he was able to rectify immediately just by looking at the person. And if that person was stubborn, and he would not allow himself to be rectified, he would remove the spark of holiness from him completely. Now, what that means, it's hard to know, but it does sound to me like that would basically be the end of the person's potential to be able to change himself. Right then, the only way they can change then is through very hard knocks, unfortunately, in life. But let's not go there. Most people, hopefully, would be in a situation where they would be willing to make a lifestyle change or make a mental change, a mindset change. Okay, those are tzaddikim who can rectify by simply looking at a person. What about others? Other kinds of tzaddikim who themselves are righteous people, but they don't have that skill, they don't have that ability, they don't have that talent, they weren't granted that ability. So, what happens with them? The tzaddik she'eno yodeh liyachid yichudim, he does not know how to do these yichudim. Tzarich lehitpalel. He has to pray for that person. Shishlach lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu hirhur tshuva, that God will send him a thought of changing himself, of repentance, of changing himself, etc., etc. Yeah. All right. All righty. Yeah. So he would pray for the person. But for a person who's not a tzaddik, or a person who's not a tzaddik of one of those two kinds, in other words, the average Joe, who's on a much lower level than that, when he sees something coarse in another person, something lowly in another person, what does that mean? He should think, God is showing this to me. Why? שהוא בעצמו גם כן יש בו גשמיות, כמו שיודע גשמיות. He himself has that problem. God is showing him what's happening with that other person so that he can rectify it in himself. A tzaddik is shown something in order for him to rectify it in another person. But for the average Joe, when he sees something negative in another person, it's because he has that within himself, either in a refined way that he doesn't recognize and he has to look much harder, or he even has it in a coarse way and he's so unself-aware. Yeah, can you say it like that? Unself-aware, that he doesn't even know that he has it, and that's why he has to be shown it. כמו שידוע, בעל שם טוב ז"ל, as the Baal Shem Tov used to say, במה שמרין לו שום דבר, anything that happens and you see, it's either או לתקן נפשו, or to rectify yourself, או לתקן חברו, or to rectify somebody else. For us, it's to rectify ourselves. For others, for a tzaddik, it's to rectify somebody else. Okay, that's a teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. I think a very important teaching from the Baal Shem Tov. Now, thank you for reminding me, Paula, about the concept of ibur. So the concept of ibur is as follows. Even if a person does the maximum that he can do, and in order to he or she obviously can the maximum they can do to rectify themselves, they can never get beyond the shoresh, the root of their own soul. Whatever the glass ceiling is, the person cannot get beyond that themselves on their own. However, there is a situation where you get what's called ibur nishmat tzadik, where the soul of a tzaddik, whether alive or no longer alive, can enter into that person to raise him up to a level beyond the source of his own soul, beyond the level, the maximum level of his own soul. That's called ibur, impregnation of the soul. This is mentioned, actually, the Arizal explains it in the parasha, which is called Ve'et Hanan, which is right towards the end of the towards the end of the Torah, towards the end of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, where Moses is telling over what the 40 years before he passes away, the 40 years of history were all about. And he says the years of wandering in the desert, the 40 years of wandering in the desert, when he was with the Jewish people, what happened, what they achieved, and what they didn't achieve, and so on and so forth, going over everything. And he then comes to this. He makes the statement. Moses makes the statement, "Vayit aber Hashem bi lema'anchem," which usually is translated by most of the translators as "God got angry with me because of you, or on your behalf, because of you." Right? Because you were sinning, so I got angry with me. Why didn't you control them, or whatever? Let's not get into it now. The Arizal explains it very differently. The Arizal explains, "Vayit aber Hashem bi," God will impregnate me into you for throughout the generations. In other words, the soul of Moses is to be found, can be found in each person of the Jewish faith, because that's who we're talking about over here. Vayit Abba Hashem bi l'ma'anchem, God made my soul. A spark of the soul of Moses is in fact in everybody, and that's why sometimes when the Talmud wants to refer to a person, they just call him. They call a person just like we would call just the average Joe, right? So in the Talmud, they sometimes call him the average Moshe. Right? Why the average Moshe? Because there's a spark of Moses in in all of us, and therefore um, that was in fact Moses' wish. He wanted it to be like that. So it's not that God got angry with him. God impregnated him into all of the souls right throughout time so that they would have this concept of the internal leader, the leader within. Because that was the primary function of Moses was the person who gave enlightenment and leadership to the Jewish people and to the whole world, in fact. But that spark of enlightenment, that spark of light, that spark of leadership is embedded within each one of us, and can be brought out and manifested. Is the ibur totally unrelated? That's a very good question. Is the ibur unrelated or associated with a person? In other words, one's great grandparents. Um, it doesn't necessarily go, family wise. It may. There's all kinds of laws of ibur that Arizal speaks about. It's a very complicated subject, but um, it's definitely related to that particular person. That person has to be able to, in order to be worthy of an ibur, of a tzadik living or dead, in a conscious way, that person has to achieve the maximum that they can possibly achieve spiritually in this world, which is not an easy task. How do you merit the Ibur? I think I just answered that. Yeah, you do the maximum that you can in order to. Where can a person find a tzaddik, and how does a person attach himself to the tzaddik? Yeah, that is the $1,000,000 question. There are tzaddikim. I know of tzaddikim in Israel, and there are here in America as well. But I tell you what, I tell you what you should do. I have a good friend who is a photographer. He lives in Jerusalem. His name is Moshe Schloss. Spell it like this. Moshe Schloss. Yeah. If you have Facebook, look up Moshe Schloss on Facebook and have a look at his website. He keeps on posting these photographs. He's got an amazing eye for seeing the light in people's faces. Let me put it to you like this. Um, if anyone is an artist, if anyone's an artist or someone who appreciates art, you see paintings of Rembrandt, for example. Rembrandt, the great Dutch painter, I think he was Dutch. Yeah, Dutch. So the great Dutch painter, Rembrandt could see in people's faces, in people in general. He could see, he could see the light to the extent that he could paint it. He painted the light in people. He's an amazing artist. If you have a look at his paintings, you'll see what I mean. He was able to paint the light like coming out of people's coming out of people's faces. Anyway, this Moshe Schloss has that same kind of ability to be able to capture the purity of the inner soul of a person. Have a look at some of his pictures. A lot of them are of young kids, and you'll see that inner beauty. So there are tzaddikim. You can see from these pictures that some of the people that he photographs are you can see that tzaddikim. And how do you find them? I don't think they advertise in the yellow pages. It's a process. It's something that you have to work at. Something you have to make inquiries, and you have to look. Someone who's going to be right for your particular soul is not necessarily going to be right for somebody else's, and therefore it's not. I wouldn't say it's not possible, but it's not the optimum way of going about things. The optimal way of going about things by asking someone to point out that tzaddik, maybe that's a good way to start, but you have to learn to discern and to figure out and be able to see, um, or that person will show himself or herself to you. There's women who are also very filled with light. All right. Um, and then attach yourself to the tzaddik. You find out like what are the things that drive that particular tzaddik, and you try to emulate them. There's a book called Tomer Devora from Tomer Devora, the palm tree of Devora, um, which is about the 13 attributes of mercy, which we should all try and emulate. It's written by the Ramak, Moshe Cordovero, who was the chief Kabbalist of the age just before the Arizal. And I actually happened to translate that book some time ago, so get the version that I translated because there's some interesting notes in it. Um, I mean, I don't sell it. It's one of the booksellers in Jerusalem. I think Targum Press. I think it's called Targum Targum Press. Can you attach yourself to tzaddik from another generation? Yes, it is. Yes, that is possible. It's not bad, yeah. It's not bad. It's readable. It was done in my younger days, but it's okay. Um, all right. Any other questions, ladies and gentlemen? All right, welcome. If one is experiencing difficulty with a certain problem, that person asks Hashem for assistance. Will Hashem cause you to assist you? I'm not sure what you mean by that, but wouldn't Hashem assist you? Yeah, but sometimes the solution to the problem is in your hands, not. In other words, God will show you the solution to the problem in your own hands. Sometimes it depends on the situation, it depends on what it is, but very often the situation is in your own hands. And very often the situation is in your own hands. You just have to learn to look at things in a different way. Um, you have to learn to look at things in a different way, and you have to learn how to put things in perspective, and you have to learn how to ignore your own ego to a certain extent. And that is how it becomes rectified. All right, you're all very, very welcome. The primary job of the Benoni is to work on himself because the tzaddik repairs the sparks of others. Yeah, generally that's the way it is. Yes, true, correct. Hashem can assign an ibur to assist you. He may. Um, um, let's put it this way: I'm not his secretary, so I don't really know, but I would imagine that definitely happens with some people, but they have to achieve the maximum they can achieve in this world on their own. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. Nothing but God. All teaching comes from God. Yes, and different paths. I don't know to what degree is Kabbalah open to me. Um, you know, Let me put it like this. That's a good question. And it's a difficult question to answer. Kabbalah is first and foremost Jewish mysticism. There is a lot of wisdom in Kabbalah that applies to everybody, and it's meant to be that way. It's meant to apply to everybody, but there's certain things in Kabbalah that are just not, no, they're not meant for you. It's like, for your particular blood type, certain foods are not good. For other people, those are specifically the foods they should eat. In other words, a person was created in a certain way because part of their that's part of their DNA. That's part of who they are. That's what they're all about. And therefore, the Kabbalah can teach a person a lot how to approach these things, but not necessarily the practices of Kabbalah, which are interwoven with Jewish practice, are for you. In fact, most likely they're not. Okay. Shabbat Shalom, and enjoy yourselves, all of you. I see someone's calling me already. All right, let's stop over here. And I'm not sure that there's going to be a class next week. Things are starting to get a little hectic before Passover, but I will let you know. All righty, all the best now. Shabbat Shalom from Colombia. Oh, very nice to see you.